You're on board the news track. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has left for the United States. The PM will be meeting President Joe Biden on the 24th of September and Vice President Kamala Harris on the 23rd. This is the Prime Minister's biggest foreign trip since the onset of the pandemic. Here's what to expect.
The stage is set for Namaste America. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 3-day visit to the United States is significant on many counts.
ये जो दृश्य है, ये अकल्पनीय है.
He will be attending the first in-person meeting of the Quad leaders.
Now, Prime Minister Modi, I'm kicking it over to you. And again, it's great to see you.
His biggest foreign trip since the COVID pandemic will also be his first to the U.S. after President Joe Biden took charge. Prime Minister Modi has a packed itinerary in the U.S. He reaches Washington, D.C. late night on Wednesday. The next morning, he will meet Apple chief Tim Cook. But the highlight of the day would be his meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris.
I, Kamala Devi Harris, solemnly swear
that I will support.
Remember, Prime Minister Modi had congratulated Harris on becoming the first woman U.S. Vice President, calling her election a historic occasion.
Foreign and domestic.
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Modi will be holding bilateral meets with its Australian and Japanese counterparts, Scott Morrison and Yoshihide Suga, and the trio will be hosted by Biden for a dinner. On Friday, Modi and Biden will hold a bilateral meet at the White House.
One of the highlights of the visit is the Prime Minister's meeting with the U.S. President, President Joe Biden in the White House. You are undoubtedly aware that this would be the Prime Minister's first in-person meeting with President Biden.
Both the leaders have met thrice virtually. The Quad Summit in March, the Climate Change Summit in April, and the G7 Summit this year. Prime Minister Modi will then be attending the Quad Leaders Summit at the White House. The grouping of four, the United States, India, Australia and Japan, is designed as a counter to China in a bid to secure the Asia-Pacific region.
We'll do so with our allies and partners through cooperation at multilateral institutions like the United Nations to amplify our collective strength and speed our progress toward dealing with these global challenges.
After a series of hectic meetings, Prime Minister Modi will travel to New York to address the UN General Assembly on Saturday. The key focus will be the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan's continuous patronage to terrorism. Prime Minister Modi has already spelt out India's stand on the new Taliban administration at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit last week.
अफगानिस्तान में सत्ता परिवर्तन इंक्लूसिव नहीं है और बिना नेगोशिएशन के हुआ है. इससे नई व्यवस्था की स्वीकार्यता पर सवाल उठते हैं.
The meetings on the highest global stage signal a new world order. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced an end to relentless wars and a beginning of relentless diplomacy. Emerging from a COVID pandemic, the biggest humanitarian crisis in 100 years, the world has new challenges ahead. With Geeta Mohan, Bureau Report, India Today.
Of the most diverse and welcoming city in the United States.
From the first visit by newly independent India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru to the Narendra Modi-Donald Trump bonhomie in Howdy Modi, India's relations with the USA have witnessed their own ups and downs. Now, this big post-pandemic meeting between Prime Minister Modi and American President Joe Biden is taking place. The COVID pandemic, the collapse of Afghanistan will be on top of the agenda. Our next report tells you about the biggest milestones in this India-USA relationship and how our equation has evolved over the past several decades.
Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of India and the Orient's greatest political and spiritual leader, flies to Washington on one of the most important state visits of recent years.
1949, the first visit by newly independent India's Prime Minister to the United States. Prime Minister Nehru and President Truman, the world's oldest democracy and the youngest democracy, in an embrace of infinite possibilities. But things didn't begin well. And in a world with deep post-war divisions, Nehru's policy of non-alignment and neutrality kept America at arm's length. A decade later, independent India hosted the first visit by a US president. President Dwight Eisenhower and Prime Minister Nehru strengthened a flagging relationship. But Nehru's policy of non-alignment would stand firm and keep India away from forging any substantial India-US relationship. Things improved dramatically in the years that followed with a young, new generation president in the White House. In 1962, the John F. Kennedy administration openly supported India during the 1962 Sino-Indian War and considered Chinese action as blatant Chinese communist aggression against India. Support that provided great hope of a burgeoning friendship.
We are in touch with the Indian government to determine their assessment of it. In order to better assess Indian needs, we are sending a team to New Delhi.
But the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 would bring that momentum to a grinding halt and foretold a sudden slide in relations. The next president in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, wasn't a big fan of India and did much to reverse all the gains his predecessors had made. President Johnson, while maintaining ties with India, began America's relationship with Pakistan, not only to ease tensions with China, but also to contain India's rise. Pakistan would flaunt American military hardware in the 1965 war with India, with tanks and fighter aircraft proving to have an edge over India's own. Even though Pakistan was still ultimately defeated and contained. But nose-diving relations between Delhi and Washington would hit rock bottom only when the next US president arrived. Taking his predecessor's Pakistan friendliness and bolstering it with massive military aid, President Richard Nixon fully pushed India into the proverbial arms of the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War. The cold, frosty Nixon-Indira Gandhi relationship would soon enter the realms of national security. In 1971, when Indira Gandhi's India mounted a ferocious campaign to liberate East Pakistan, President Nixon sent the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal to intimidate India. A ploy that didn't work, the war ending in a blistering military defeat for Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh. India's first nuclear tests in 1974 were frowned upon by President Nixon. But with no real relations, there were no sanctions to be applied on India. Following India's emergency, two new national leaders, Prime Minister Morarji Desai and President Jimmy Carter, would gradually attempt to rescue relations between the two countries. Even though India did not support the US invasion of Afghanistan by the turn of the decade.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
But it was the next US President, Ronald Reagan, who pushed the button on a slew of military supply programs for India, including help with the newborn Light Combat Aircraft project. Through the turbulent 80s, the Reagan administration and India, under Indira and then her son Rajiv Gandhi, would continue to build on ties, ever aware of how fragile they had proven to be in the past.
Good afternoon.
The Bill Clinton P.V. Narasimha Rao years are seen by contemporary historians as a time of missed opportunities and contradictory policies. In the early 90s, India had just flipped the difficult switch on economic liberalization, but was also dealing with the beginnings of militancy and Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in Kashmir. The restoration of American aid to Pakistan in 1995 by President Clinton would give India the impetus it needed to go the distance in its nuclear ambitions. Three years later, here in the wastelands of Pokhran, Rajasthan, a bomb was literally dropped on India-U.S. relations.
Today, at 15:45 hours, India conducted 3 underground nuclear tests in the Pokhran range. These tests conducted today were with a fission device, a low-yield device, and a thermonuclear device.
India's arrival on the nuclear stage in 1998 under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee triggered an instantaneous reaction from Washington. President Clinton instantly ordered sanctions against India, cutting off all military and economic aid and freezing loans by American banks to the Indian public sector. All the good work done under the Reagan administration in the 80s came to an end. But the sanctions turned out to be a dud and did nothing to stop India's economic rise. In 2000, by the turn of the millennium, when President Clinton visited India after the Kargil War, it was seen as the beginning of a renewed, tentative friendship.
This is terrorist.
But it was the following administration in Washington under President George W. Bush, in the weeks and months after the 9/11 terror attacks, that truly pushed a partnership with India.
Mr. Prime Minister, welcome to the United States.
Centered around the common enemy of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, India and the United States forged a strategic partnership that became the seed from which everything would grow going forward, including everything you see today.
Of India's complete support in this.
Things were finally moving forward strategically and at a steady clip. In 2002-2003, India and the US would hold their first Malabar naval exercise, a military drill that has become the centerpiece of today's Quad partnership. Gone were the inhibitions of the past. With a track record of suspicion and hostile policy action, the two nations were ready to embrace for real. That new relationship enshrined in the 2008 India-US civil nuclear agreement, which Manmohan Singh staked his very prime ministership on. There would be no looking back. Under President George W. Bush and then under President Obama, the Manmohan Singh administration would open the gates to huge military armament supplies from the United States, with deals for transport aircraft, maritime surveillance jets, missiles, combat helicopters, and much else. In 2007, the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Strategic Dialogue, would take birth. A strategic partnership between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. But it would take another 10 years for it to fully take form. Meanwhile, the India-US weapons deals were sweetening the pipeline and paving the way for the first truly interpersonal relationship between an Indian Prime Minister and a US President. First, this hug in Washington, and then this hug in India. Entwined in these warm gestures was the fact that a Prime Minister who had earlier been blocked for entry by the United States was now a favored friend and an ally in the region. And but for a few bristling comments over the years on the topic of discrimination and unity, Modi and Obama held the alliance together in strong hands, pushing it across the realms of trade, strategic affairs, and culture. But if Modi and Obama exuded the Jhappiwala warmth, the next relationship would explode in terms of camaraderie and body language. Famously, the Howdy Modi event in Houston in 2019, when Modi and President Donald Trump would take what looked like victory laps in front of a hysterical diaspora crowd. Another viral moment was this one, when the bonhomie spilt over at the G7 summit in France. And finally, right before the COVID-19 pandemic would change the world forever, the massive Namaste Trump event at the Motera Stadium in Gujarat in 2020, where the two leaders emblazoned their friendship in the consciousness of history books. And finally now, in a world that has changed dramatically in the last 18 months, stand the leaders of the two countries once again. From the COVID pandemic, to the rise of ISIS, to the collapse of Afghanistan. In their hands are the aspirations, safety, and prosperity of billions, and literally peace in this new world we've inherited. What Modi and Biden forge and the partnership they craft will be something the world will be counting on.